Hello, everybody. Welcome to the comprehensive yet informal study of the Encyclopedia Sciences. This is the logic we're on, the Encyclopedia Logic. I hope we get to the other Encyclopedia Sciences, but that'll probably take a good while. So for now, this is just the study of the logic. Um, the shorter logic, not the science of logic. That's a whole different work outside of the Encyclopedia Sciences, not to be confused. Um, with this, which is the Encyclopedia Logic, also known as the shorter logic. This is section two. We started section one last time, where we kind of talked about um, how philosophy doesn't really presuppose its objects, unlike other sciences, and it needs to start with mere association, because any presupposition would kind of not really be in good faith and not really be justified. And it would be far really fall into another science. Philosophy, the whole point of it is to kind of step back and really look at the foundations of what you're thinking. And then Hegel goes on to say that, of course, we can't start from nowhere, and we need to start from somewhere. And any starting point is itself a presupposition. So we're just going to start, and then we're going, like Patrick said, we're going to negate and dialectically investigate what's going on with philosophy. And we also talked about the object of philosophy is God, which Hegel identifies as the truth. And then it also investigates the things in the realm of the finite, nature and human spirit, and as they relate to God as their truth, because God is the truth fundamentally, right? Because philosophy is the fundamental science. So God is the fundamental truth. That's kind of implicit there, I think. So the finite nature and human spirit, God is the truth of all of these things inherently. And we need to start somewhere, so we start with the associated representations. Um, yeah, and then uh, we get into some necessity. Yeah. Well, this is where he talked about the necessity of its content being shown. Yeah, basically what I just said. I'm not going to end up repeating myself if I go into it too much. But that's the gist of what we went over last time. Now we're entering section two. None of these sections have titles, so as far as I'm aware, anyway. So just section one was last time, which was all what I just said. Section two, we're going to begin. We have Pat and Harrison here today, and do any of you guys have preliminary comments? And then after that, we will choose someone to read.
Yeah, something occurred to me
Yeah.
while you were talking about how, like, the nature of presuppositions in Hegel, or the nature of, like, his presupposition of just starting and then proceeding dialectically,
Mm.
um, how much this really is a return to Plato and Plato's idea of dialectic, right? Because in Plato, you start with what Hegel would call natural consciousness, and um, something is simply presupposed or put forward, namely, like, a definition that is given by somebody in natural consciousness. And then the contradictions of that are, of course, ruled out and then, you know, uh,
Sublated, yeah.
sublated, exactly, right? Um,
Aufhebung happens, we get new begriff notion.
Right, exactly. But how much this is a move away from the sort of axiomatic mathematical thinking that characterizes the early modern period, and back to Plato, a return back to Plato, because it occurred to me that Plato, too, in addition to this dialectical method, has the same idea of simply starting anywhere.
Yeah,
Of
Hegel
course, his starting
agrees with
point
that.
yeah, of course, his starting point is
Yes, I
really
know.
natural consciousness, which I know in the
I was gonna
phenomenology,
say he does that with sense certainty.
he doesn't. Well, natural consciousness, sense certainty is not natural consciousness.
What do you mean by natural consciousness?
So, natural consciousness for Hegel is the unphilosophical consciousness
Oh,
that is
oh,
just like
okay.
basically common sense
Oh,
as
I'm
we're
sorry.
going
Okay,
along,
I didn't know.
right?
Yeah,
So
okay.
that's not the same as sense certainty. So in the
No.
phenomenology, we don't start with natural consciousness actually,
Okay, yeah.
because natural consciousness in the
I
phenomenology is
thought you meant like
already
empirical consciousness. I'm sorry. Okay.
no
Oh,
natural
gotcha.
consciousness. Yeah, no, I mean that's ambiguous, but that's just the way Hegel uses the term.
Yeah, I just was forgetting. So, okay, cool. Yeah, you're right. This is definitely more of a return to the Platonic tradition in that sense. Yeah, I agree. You can start anywhere, and we have to start somewhere. Although, like he kind of implicitly says here, it doesn't really matter. We're gonna get, we're gonna dialectically progress regardless. So that seems to be what's happening anyway. So yeah. With all that said, does anyone want to start reading section two? I can take it away, I guess. To begin with, philosophy can be determined in general terms as thinking consideration of objects. Did something get cut off there? Oh, oh no, as a thinking consideration of objects. I'm sorry. Okay, let me start over. To begin with, philosophy can be determined in general terms as a thinking consideration of objects. But if it is correct, as it indeed is, that the human being distinguishes itself from the animals by thinking, then everything human is human because it is brought about through thinking, and for that reason alone. This is kind of an Aristotelian line of thinking here. Now, since philosophy is a peculiar mode of thinking, a mode by which thinking becomes cognition, I wonder if he's using the Kantian definition that we just went over in Kant study, but we'll see. And conceptually comprehensive cognition at that, philosophical thinking will also be diverse from the thinking that is active in everything human and brings about the very humanity of what is human, even though it is also identical with this thinking, and in itself there is only one thinking. This distinction is connected with the fact that the human import of consciousness, which is based on thinking, does not appear in the form of thought straight away, but as feeling, intuition, representation, which are forms that have to be distinguished from thinking itself as form. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. We have, so we begin by talking basically about Aristotle's idea of human. Well, actually, we begin with a definition of philosophy. So it's a consideration of objects, and then we get into this Aristotelian line of thinking that what makes human being human is thinking, uh, and talks about talking about thinking as the in itself. There's only one thinking, which I find interesting and a little bit vague, but we'll probably expand that. Uh, Distinction is connected with the fact that human. Oh yeah, and then we don't really begin thinking. Uh, we don't really realize think like we don't really do this reflective. Uh, we don't really realize the form of thinking. We don't really investigate our logic, our abstract notions. We just kind of begin thinking through feeling, intuitions, and representations, which also goes back to what he was talking about earlier in the first section, where he begins. Uh, uh, the reason is in order time conscious produces representations for concepts of them. So I think he's just kind of referring to that notion again here. Um, so yeah, he's just kind of laying things out. I think I'm not sure if there are too many arguments being made yet. Uh, Anyone else have any commentary on this paragraph?
No.
All right.
Yeah, not this one.
Okay. Does anyone want to pick up reading this like indented paragraph?
Sure. It is an old prejudice, a saying that is now a cliché, that man is distinguished from the lower animals by thinking. It may seem to be a cliché, but must also seem remarkable that there is no need to recall this old belief. Yet one can hold that the need is there in view of the prejudice of our day and age, which separates feeling and thinking from each other in such a way that they are supposedly opposed to each other and are even hostile. So hostile that feeling, religious feeling in particular, is contaminated, perverted, or even so totally destroyed by thinking.
John
And that
Lennon
religion
style.
and that religion and religiosity do not have their root and their place in thinking. Making a separation of this kind, well,
Do you want to
making a
go to the
separation
footnote
of
or
this
no?
kind,
Oh, there is no footnote yet. We can't see. I'm sorry about that. All right. You can take.
I think it's an end note.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about that.
Making a separation of this kind means forgetting that only man is capable of religion, and that the lower animals have no religion any more than right and morality belong to them. Now
So this is a
that's
lot more
interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, this is one thing that's very interesting to me about this is how for lack of a better word popular it is, how non um this is not dry academics right here. This is an interesting sort of defense of the unity of religion and rationality. And he points out that this disjunction of religion and rationality is a byproduct of our specific day and age.
Which
And
is, I guess,
Hegel
his day
means,
and age.
well, it is, but it hasn't stopped
Oh yeah, yeah. I was gonna
in
say, yeah.
in this particular case,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You're right.
Before the Enlightenment, there was certainly no disjunction between religiosity and thinking, right? Higher learning was associated with
If
religiosity.
anything, I would say Kant assisted in this disjunction
Yeah, well,
as like the
Kant
prime
actually,
Enlightenment thinker.
but Kant's reasons are, while not metaphysical, they're still grounded in
Yeah,
rationality.
you're right, actually. So maybe that's not a good
Um,
example.
So actually, it's more of the reaction against Kant, right? Kant sees himself as an Enlightenment thinker, and one thinker which Hegel references sometimes, which I barely know anything about him, but he brings him up several times, is Jacobi,
Mm.
who is not a philosopher. He is more of an anti-philosopher against the Enlightenment, and says, "Look at what the Enlightenment does. It brings about, atheism. It brings about the end of religiosity." And this is a popular figure at the time in this counter Enlightenment,
Hmm.
right? This end of Enlightenment, the emergence of conservatism and romanticism in the early 19th century,
Hmm.
in response, in large part, to the French Revolution, right? Which is Enlightenment consciousness taken to sort of an extreme,
Yeah.
and they have
Radical
this
liberation and so on.
right,
It's
and
just-
it's they attack the churches, right? They come after the church, and this sort of solidifies this connection between Enlightenment thinking and atheism, and therefore the critique of the Enlightenment, the counter reaction against the Enlightenment, which we still have the echo of today in this divorce between religious and or the religious and rational thinking
mm,
that exists at least in popular consciousness. Um, and
definitely, yeah.
Hegel is saying that this is a byproduct of our particular age in particular, right? If you look at it historically, this is
Hmm.
not the case, first of all. And second of all, that this separation makes the distinction, right? Animals are capable of feeling, right? Animals are not capable of rationality. Who has the religion?
Mm.
Human beings have
Yep.
religion
Yeah.
because they're capable of
He
rationality.
draws that
Animals have
interesting.
feeling,
Yep.
and they don't have any religion. In a very, very interesting thing to notice.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Little correlation there that will definitely, I think, turn into more of a like necessary link. Um,
because, yeah,
well,
I mean,
he implies that in this paragraph, but he will explore that further.
For Hegel, as for Kant, the absolute is an idea of reason,
Mm.
right? Not something directly felt,
Mm.
not an intuition. In the preface to the Phenomenology, he talks very much about how this sort of intuition people supposedly have of God um, is empty.
Yeah.
Is basically hollow, it
Hollow
just
husk of a
says,
notion or
yeah,
something like
yeah,
that.
it's
Yeah.
a hollow husk of the notion, and it doesn't have any content, and the content can only happen through thinking,
Cognition.
through
Yeah.
rationality. Yeah, exactly. Um, so it's very interesting that he seems to be asserting religion as such, and this religious enthusiasm, this religious feeling, only derive as a secondary byproduct where you take reason only so far as to accept um, God, the absolute, then throw it away. And
Yeah.
now all you need is the absolute, and it's this husk of itself. So, yeah, interesting. Those are my remarks.
Yeah. I would agree with pretty much everything you said. I think. Don't disagree. Really. Yeah. Religion and thinking are tied together, and Hegel actually, like, spoiler alert, thinks religious thinking is one of the highest forms of human thought, and basically says it's the I don't know. It's basically like the absolute, but minus like some, like, is it the unreflected maybe, or I don't know, or I think he calls it like the immediate experience of the absolute. It's something like that, but where like you basically attain like what you're looking for, but you don't, like, you're lacking an essential component in like the realization of it as the absolute. So uh, but it's definitely up there in like the highest forms of human thinking, and you can kind of see that in just based on where it is in phenomenology, and some of the things he says about it, which I haven't really got to, which is why I don't know too much about it. I'm only I'm not I'm at the end of the reason section, so I've not even gotten to spirit, but based on what I've heard and what I've read elsewhere, I'm pretty sure that is the case for Hegel. So yeah, and as we can just see even in this paragraph, he's going to link religious thought and just philosophical thought once again, and in quite a necessary way. And it looks like he's going to
Well,
continue that in this next paragraph. So
I think I've heard some people describe Hegel as the Protestant Aquinas.
yes, this is another nickname for Hegel.
uh, which is interesting because it contains not only the idea that he's not just a Protestant translation of Aquinas, but he translates what Hegel would call the spirit of the essence of Protestantism
Mm.
into that kind of thinking, right?
Yeah.
Not being dogmatic, right?
Mm.
Because of course Hegel as a Protestant is very critical of Catholicism and would call it dogmatic.
Probably, yeah. Which I do want to look more into his religious thought specifically, and like his actual like specific assertions and claims. I would like to. That would be interesting. Maybe they'll pop up here. Who knows?
I just got to the part of the phenomenology that's anti-Semitic.
Oh no.
Inevitable.
Yeah. Womp womp. Um. Cool. Does anyone want to read this next paragraph, or I can do it?
Uh,
I'll do it.
Okay.
When the separation between religion and thinking is asserted, one has in mind the thinking that can be called thinking over, the reflective thought that has thoughts as such as its content, and brings them to consciousness. Because the distinction with regard to thinking that is clearly indicated by philosophy is neglected, the crudest notions and complaints against philosophy are brought forth. Religion, right, and ethical life belong to man alone, and that only because he is thinking essence. For that reason, thinking in its broad sense has not been inactive in these spheres, even at the level of feeling and belief, or of representation. The activity of productions of thinking are present in them and are included in them, but it is one thing to have feelings and representations that are determined and permeated by thinking, and another to have thoughts about them. The thoughts about these modes of consciousness generated by thinking them over are what reflection, argumentation, and the like, as well as philosophy, are comprehended under.
Okay. And then there's a new paragraph. So.
I think
Yeah.
this is largely a continuation.
Yeah. He makes a connection between the uh, yeah, basically just elaborating why they are um separated, philosophy and just thinking, like specifically philosophical thinking. Which calls thinking over. Uh, and I guess philosophy does the thinking. Oh, okay, yeah. So this kind of goes into what I was actually talking about earlier when he says it's like the absolute, but like the unreflected absolute. This is kind of I think what he's referring to. Philosophy thinks things over and doesn't just. So he says here, it is one thing to have feelings and interpretations that are determined and permeated by thinking, and another to have thoughts about them. So I think he thinks religion is the former and philosophy the latter, but they're both
Right.
very similar, and just philosophy goes that extra
They're
step.
permeated by thinking in the sense that um, by by dealing with the absolute, religion is fundamentally dealing with
The
a
thinking,
category of thought. Yeah.
yes,
Or not a category, but a
thinking
notion,
itself,
I
yeah,
think. Because the absolute in itself is what Hegel would call a notion of thought.
yeah,
So it's like the content of religion is thought, but
mm-hmm.
not explicitly because there's no
Yes,
thinking actually happening in it.
yes. In other words, to go back to like what we were saying up here, um, oh, where was it? Something about like the form. Oh, yes, yes. Uh, thinking itself as form. That's kind of what philosophy has. But at first we receive feeling, intuition, represent. These are the kinds of things that religion deals with. So obviously it's still like valid and important, but philosophy just goes that extra step, and that's why they are connected. However, they shouldn't be divorced in such a way that we view religion as contaminated, perverted, or totally destroyed by thinking. That's just not true when considered from the Hegelian viewpoint. Cool. Okay. Any other thoughts on that one? All
Nope,
right.
nope.
Let's move on. Anyone want to read this paragraph? I can read it. In this context, it has happened, and the misunderstanding has prevailed quite often, that mediation of this kind, or thinking over, was alleged to be the condition, or even the only way for us to arrive at the representation of what is eternal and true, and the belief that it is so. For instance, the now rather obsolete metaphysical proofs that there is a God were passed off in this way, as if it were essentially and exclusively through our being acquainted with them and being convicted of their validity that the belief and conviction that there is a God could be brought about. This sort of assertion is like saying that we can only eat after we have become acquainted with the chemical, botanical, or zoological determinations of our food, and that we should delay our digestion until we have completed the study of anatomy and physiology. If that were so, these sciences would certainly gain greatly in usefulness in their field, just as philosophy would in its field. Indeed, their usefulness would be raised into an absolute and universal indispensability. But then, too, instead of being indispensable, they would not exist at all. So this is another actually really interesting paragraph. I think. Um, so to break this down, so Hegel's basically saying that there isn't really a way, uh, I guess, to historically set this up. Well, he kind of does that, right? He's saying, okay, so there was a time, and I'm guessing he has in mind the medieval period, where people were like, oh, so we need to know there is a God, so we need to come up with these arguments and investigate these things. So
Well,
that
it's not just the medieval period, right? It's the early modern period.
sure, I guess with like Descartes and stuff, but my mind went to medieval. But yeah, so at any point in history, or maybe not any, but there are specific points in history where they were passed off in this way. In what way? In the sense of like that the example he brings up earlier that these are necessary, right? Just kind of like how the notion of it would be necessary to understand exactly the process of digestion and food to eat food and digest it in the same way that in those specific points in history, people were thinking, oh, we need to understand exactly what God is, to comprehend God in the first place. Um, and Hegel's saying it's kind of ridiculous, because if that were the case, then it wouldn't really exist at all. And, right? Instead of being indispensable, they wouldn't exist at all. So Hegel's big point here is that no, really, what we do is we come up with the representation of what is eternal and true, and the belief that it is so. We don't really need to do this thinking over of it. We need to receive it first, and then kind of bottom up work it, and then see and analyze it after receiving it. Kind of doing this top down approach doesn't really make logical sense. Things wouldn't really
Well,
exist if we didn't already have first an idea of it.
to me, it seems like what he has in mind is what Kant has already said. Um, this is in the Critique of Practical Reason, I think, which is probably why you, or either that, or it's near the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. Um, Kant talks about the fact that these ontological proofs, like all these metaphysical proofs, are completely unnecessary, superfluous, because guess what? The overwhelming majority of people who believe in God have never even heard of them,
Yeah.
right? Um, what is the argument that they normally actually receive for it? It's first it's actually the cosmological, or the physio-cosmological argument, which is not really metaphysical. It's the idea of like, if no God, it's the thing that's been debunked by evolution. If no God, why squirrel?
Yeah.
Um, and also the moral and the cultural reasons for the existence of God, right? Which Kant says holds sway. So I think this is something very similar. I don't know how God arrives on the scene for Hegel
Well, I
exactly.
think I think he I think he's trying to say something about that here, specifically
He's
with this.
saying that, well, he's saying that it's not the metaphysical, right?
No, well, no,
He's saying
he's
we,
saying I think it's in context to what he was saying on the previous page too, about or even just the first, right? Consciousness produces representations before it produces concepts. So I think in this case, we receive God, and then before forming conceptual metaphysical arguments about God, we kind of receive God, and then
but in
Hegel's
what
saying,
way?
uh, I mean, considering God is the truth in Hegel, we kind of are confronted with uh, just reality, and then we dialectically work bottom up, and then kind of understand things rather
But I
than.
think, but we're talking about God like the word God, really. Like we're talking about God as like explicitly labeled as God. Do you know what I'm saying?
Aren't they always interchangeable? Like God and the
No.
truth,
So for an
the
everyday
absolute.
person, no, but look, so for an everyday person, right?
Mm-hmm.
For someone in natural consciousness, right, who is religious, their idea of God generally is not um is not, what we're confronted with every day.
Mm-hmm.
Is not this panentheistic whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like God is all truth thing. It's this idea of, or I mean, he even says, what does he say? Image, not a concept. Um, I mean, basically, it's man in the sky, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's saying that's where we start with.
Hmm. Well, in some way or another, we receive. I think the point is less about the details and more just about the. I think this last
Yes, I
line
agree.
kinds of.
That's what I'm saying. I think it. I agree with you. I think it's not about the details. I think it's I think at this point he's simply saying, "Listen, we don't receive this idea of God through metaphysical
No,
proofs."
exactly. We just it's a more like direct, like unmediated. Um,
I don't know that it's direct or unmediated either. It might be a product of like
sure, but less
historical
mediated
necessity.
than metaphysical proofs.
Yeah, Okay.
we don't start from abstract metaphysics. We start from, like you're saying, natural consciousness.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what I've been trying to say this time. Yeah, we work from bottom up, not top to bottom. Basically, is yeah. Okay, and that is the second section. That wasn't as long as I thought. Do you guys want to move on to the third section? It's
Sure.
only.
In a different video.
You want to do it in a different video? You think 30
Yeah.
minutes is okay? Alrighty. Well, then we'll see you in section 3 in the next video, which will probably film shortly. People are still up for it. Cool. See you next time. Make sure you dialectically advance your notion of God. That's our daily. That's our end of Hegel study lesson of the day. I don't know. All right. Bye.